If your websites conduct transactions or collect sensitive data, you have a material risk on your hands that could cost millions. The client-side security gap is being exploited daily with attacks like digital skimming, credential harvesting, and form jacking. 98% of sites use first and third-party JavaScript to power and enhance the user experience, opening up the client side to the adversary. Unlike most things in security, there is an easy fix. Start by understanding your risk. Let Source Defense give you a site-wide risk report this week. Visit securityweekly.com/source defense. Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cybercriminals are hiding in the conversation. Cybercriminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified these 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Don't forget to visit securityweekly.com/subscribe, where you can subscribe to all the shows on the Security Weekly network, including Adrian's Enterprise Security Weekly. Yay. Among others. You can join our Discord channel, follow us on social media. Also right there at the top of the page on securityweekly.com/subscribe, you can find episode starter packs, a collection of Spotify playlists with some of our favorite episodes from years past. These are great if you're new to the show and want to listen to some amazing interviews and segments. And we're back talking about the security news for this week. I'm drinking rum, drinking some Zacapa. Have you had Zacapa before, Adrian?
I have.
It's good. I haven't had rum in a while.
1 year or something like that?
It's well, I can tell you what it was. There wasn't. It was a 23. I say was because it's empty now. There was a little bit left. I decided to polish it off. So Zacapa 23. It's really good. So
I am having Lagavulin 16.
Now, is that 16? Is that like Lagavulin is a very smoky peat, more peaty than smoky. It's very high peat. But is the some of their barrelings, like in aged ones, aren't as peaty as some of the other ones in Lagavulin, or the most
all
are
the
peaty?
Ones I've had are pretty peaty. I've had the 8. I think there's a 12, and then the Nick. What's his name from from that show? Nick Offerman.
Yeah.
The Nick Offerman special edition is 11 years. I think they're all peaty. That's their thing. It's kind of like Lafroig. I don't think they have.
Oh yeah. I always get Lagavulin and Lafroig confused. Maybe it was a Lafroig. One of the two.
No, Lafroig is pretty peaty too.
Yeah, but each of them have a version, like one particular offering that is not as peaty. One of them might be an 18 and one
maybe.
Of those.
Okay.
Yeah. It's good stuff. Good stuff. Well, let's talk about some good stuff. Well, let's talk about how a coding error caused an outage that left millions without service. Now, this one was not cyber criminals. So when you read through this article, most of us will have like flashbacks from previous lives. And tell me if this sounds familiar. So deleting the filter caused all possible routes to the internet to pass through the routers. I don't know where else they would pass through other than routers. Like this article tried to go not just 30,000 foot view, but like a 50,000 foot view of the technical details. So you kind of have to read between the lines. So deleting the filter caused all possible routes to the internet to pass through the routers, resulting in several of the devices exceeding their memory and processing capabilities. This caused the core network to shut down. So what I'm thinking happened is someone was trying to make some changes to the routing tables. Yep. And in routing tables, you apply what they call filters, right? Depending on the routing protocol, it might... the moniker or the term might be something different, but that caused most of the internet traffic to pass through a select subset of their routers, right? Because I would imagine when you're an ISP, most of your traffic passes through routers, right? So I don't know where the article is trying to be really high level. in the explanation, and caused those routers obviously to exceed their capacity. Now, I've been in this situation as the security person. So looking at this from a security perspective, typically when this happens, folks on your team come to you and go, we must be under a DDoS attack. Like all of a sudden our routers are like smoking hot, like there's literally smoke coming out of them. There must be some kind of DDoS attack. And you spend hours trying to figure out like where is this attack coming from and what's happening. And so you spend those hours trying to find a breach or some kind of, DDoS scenario. And then they come back and they're like, oh, no, thanks for that. But we made a mistake updating our routing tables, actually.
There's a term for that. Hanlon's razor. Are you familiar with Hanlon's razor?
No, what's Hanlon's razor?
Never attribute to malice what can be attributed to stupidity.
Yes. Well, and I think it's kind of harsh. I wouldn't call it stupidity. Like someone made a mistake.
Well, I mean, the point applies, right?
Yeah.
Like sure, it's an accident or something like that, but people tend to jump to kind of like the Hollywood movie version of it. And it's somebody screwed up DNS or somebody screwed up BGP or
I agree with that. I just don't want to apply the moniker of stupidity to really talented network engineers, because understanding
carelessness.
Carelessness. It's carelessness.
Yeah, there you go.
It's carelessness, not stupidity. Because managing a routing protocol is super hard. It's not trivial, especially if you're at the ISP level, and especially Rogers was this Canadian. Ask Guy, right? This was a Canadian provider that provided much of the service.
Canada was out.
Most of Canada was out as a result of this. Yeah. So that was not.
It's not a DDoS or a problem. It's an unscheduled load test on the routers.
That's exactly what it was.
So it kind of reminds me, and I tried to find the name of the company. I couldn't find it, but there was this trading firm that went under. I think this was back in 2011 or something like that, because of a lack of code. So this was kind of the opposite issue. It was a lack of automation, too much manual work, or maybe it was similar. I don't. Yeah. Like you said, we don't know quite enough details here to really know how things went south. But they updated the code on 7 of 8 of these trading servers that they had, and missed the last one. And basically, dev code that had this testing algorithm in it went to production. And this testing algorithm would do a bunch of crazy automated trades that you would never do in production, that nobody using their service had asked for. And basically within, I forget what it was, like a couple of hours, they had lost like $300 million or something like that. And an investor kept them alive for a little bit, but ultimately it was the death of the company.
Right. See, I would have gone the opposite way. I would have updated 1 out of the 8 servers first. See how that went. If I had 8, you don't often have the luxury of having 8 when you're.
Well, and the thing here was, this testing code worked so quickly. It didn't matter how quickly they realized what the issue was. Like, it was losing money so fast.
Hey, fail fast, man. Right.
Maybe not.
Maybe not in this case.
Maybe not in this case.
Oops. Now, another interesting thing was my story number 4, which is seemingly the opposite. So Apple network traffic went through Russia for 12 hours. So it said if the traffic was rerouted so this was a BGP issue. Now, what I plucked out of the article was they state, however, if the traffic was rerouted on purpose, the ordeal would point to Russia carrying out a border gateway protocol hijacking. And you're like, all right, like maybe we don't have enough evidence to say if, along the lines of this conversation we started the segment with, was it an accident? Was it carelessness? I like that term in this context. Was it carelessness, or was something malicious going on? And up until this point in the article, like, you really don't know. But then I read the next part. So it says, while the nature of this accident is unclear, this wouldn't be the first time Rostelecom had performed a BGP hijacking attack. In April 2020, over 200 content delivery networks were redirected through Ross Telecom, and the article implies that was attributed to a malicious attack.
So come on,
there's a track record here. So now, I mean, we don't have evidence or a smoking gun, but we've got some previous incidents to maybe point to intent.
Wasn't there a Chinese incident a few years ago for 18 minutes? Like 90% of the traffic on the internet was rerouted through China.
Yeah, that happens. That happened a lot.
Yeah, no, it happened actually a lot.
Well, a lot. I say a lot, but like it's not unheard of, I should say, that these happen. And if you were to analyze these incidents, like, would they be 100% malicious intent? Probably not. Like, there's a mixture of someone made an oops in a routing table update for BGP, or someone made an oops on purpose, basically, right?
Yeah. And you can do the oops on purpose. It's shocking how much you can abuse and mess with BGP.
Yeah, Joff has talked about that. Yeah.
Doesn't violate how the protocol works.
Right. It's meant to be free and
there's
open.
a lot of honor system out there.
Yes. So there you have it. Where do we want to go next? What's really interesting?
Was that were you talking about the Apple one? Because that's basically okay. Yeah.
That was the Apple one. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. How about the APT? How about the apt-get?
Yeah, so I've been listening to some
because I have opinions.
Yeah, I mean, I've been listening to a lot of Linux podcasts. Like, I've been getting really Linux and nerdy. Well, it's been my main operating system on all my devices for quite some time. I'm like really getting kind of nerdy with it, and I've been really getting into listening to some Linux podcasts out there. I can say that Spotify's kind of messed up on my laptop, but there is one that I really like too, and I can't remember the name of it. In any case, and I'll give people a full rundown of some of the Linux ones that I've been kind of like subscribing to a bunch, listening to them, then kind of weeding it out, right?
Because there's a podcast.
Yeah, there's a lot of different podcasts out there, and some of them have some really good tips. And also I'm finding like I got to find a host that I really like. Like, I find you got to have some kind of connection to the hosts on there. And I'm trying to give everyone a fair shot, not just listen to the first 10 minutes or one episode and judging it based on that. So we get a lot of really cool Linux tips. And some of the podcasts are talking about the alternatives to apt and how apt is somewhat antiquated at this point. And this happens a lot in open source. We standardize on a particular tool, and we kind of just carry that forward and use it for 10 plus years, and not realize like, like there's probably a better way. Like this whole process could be updated, like the multi-threading downloads, which app does some of, probably distribution dependent, and just other issues and how it handles dependencies. I used to use a tool called Aptitude to manage a bunch of my systems, largely because I was working for Brown University at the time, and the developer of Aptitude, or one of the developers of Aptitude, came out of Brown's computer science department, or someone knew there was some connection there, and so I had started using that, and that's like an ncurses interface to manage your apt packages, which was pretty cool. For whatever reason, I stopped using it. So this article talks about Nala as a brand new interface, and it's got some shiny things. Now, part of me is like, it is somewhat like reminiscent of Aptitude, in that it has colors and that ncurses kind of feel to it. And but I'm still kind of skeptical, right? Because when you do stuff with packages on Linux, I'm like, if it's not right, it can go wrong. And you can yes, you can go wrong. Is that what you're getting at, Adrian?
This is a great place for me to jump in with my opinion.
Is that what you're saying? Like, if it goes wrong, like, it can really suck?
Like I've tried all the Linux distros over the years, and I've tried all the fancy, like, stop using apt, use this instead. And more often than not, it goes wrong. And these days, I'm just not willing to go with something that's replacing something that's so essential, so central to running and maintaining a working Linux system. I know how easy it is for everything to go wrong. And like, it's Linux, it's always recoverable, but it's working fine. Yeah. It's working fine right now. I'm not going to go out of my way to break it. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Like
the problem is other people are going to go out of their way to break it.
And
so you've got cyber criminals.
And what's the payoff here? What's the payoff?
Exactly. To that point, like, the juice has to be worth the squeeze. And
an extra 2 minutes?
Yeah. If I'm going to gain some benefit and there's a risk that it could cause, like, there has to be a balance there. And I guess to your point, like, apt works great. Most examples, out there are using apt. And if I deviate from that, like, there has to be a lot of benefit there. Is it there for this? Is trying it going to break stuff? And then, to your point, Adrian, yeah, I can recover it. But, like, we all got a lot of, like, day jobs and podcasts to do. Like, we got a lot of stuff going on.
Lives, children.
Lives, children. Like, how much time do I really want to spend troubleshooting something that could have totally been avoided, I guess is our point, right?
I recently went a full month without using my framework laptop. So the first thing I did was I ran apt to update.
You guys have your framework laptops. I just have an email that says they're preparing for shipment, which is just like a total T. I'm like, what does that mean? Does that mean you're stretching to like preparation to lift the boxes to put it on the truck? Like, what is that? I'm like, I want it. I want it so bad.
So, and I take that back. I'm not using apt because I'm using Fedora, and I think the tool is DNF, which cracks me up because I'm a big racing fan, and DNF means did not finish.
Right.
But it's pretty similar to apt, and I was a month behind on stuff, and I don't even know how much time it took because I don't watch it. Like, I go do something else while it's running. So not only am I not looking for that process to happen quicker, I don't even know how long it takes because it's not disruptive. It's not like your Xbox or your PlayStation when it needs a firmware update. All you want to do is sit in the couch, play a game, and you're literally staring at the progress bar going by.
I mean, firmware updates are different, right? They're going to prevent you from using the system for a whole host of reasons, but your non-firmware based updates like you get from apt or DNF should just happen, to your point. I mean, there are some systems I manage in production where I'll give them a plug, as they used to be a sponsor on the show. I don't know if they are at any of the shows, but Automox automates that for me and applies those updates in the background. It's a commercial product and gives you all that stuff. Now, I don't have it set to reboot the systems because they are in production, so I still log into all of my systems and check to see if there's a reboot and do that on off periods. But for production systems, I don't even see those, to your point, Adrian, like, I don't even see those updates. They just happen, and that has to happen very reliably.
Yeah, and we see this a lot with commercial products also, somebody trying to solve a non-issue, basically. And you've got like, it's showing you the fastest mirrors and the ping speed and stuff like that.
I gotta say, I mean, it's a non-issue.
I don't care.
It's a non-issue, but it's an issue. And I mean, let me explain what I mean. So my dad taught computer science, worked on computers all his life, the whole 9 yards. And, he worked on some of the first multics, which are time-sharing machines. Okay, so prior to Unix, prior to Linux, okay? And he would tell me, like, you'd put in your punch cards, and you'd go to lunch. And while you were into lunch, the operators would load your punch cards, run your job, and you'd get your output when you came back.
Did they call, back in those days, operators were called priests?
I don't know.
Was that more on the main... I mean, were those mainframe-based systems?
Those are mainframe-based systems.
Mainframe-based systems, they were called priests as well. Of the
priests?
Okay.
Yes.
The priests of the machine god. But,
correct. Yes.
So, I mean, what you're telling me sounds very similar. Like, I started the update running, and then I go have lunch. I go make dinner, I go play a basketball game with a kid, whatever. And it's like, that's what he used to do with his jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, oh, wow, how much time is being wasted? Is it a problem?
No.
He went and did productive
maybe you
things.
misunderstood something. Like you don't have to go do something else. Like, you're literally not waiting on anything to do this update.
It's just happening. You're not installing.
It's happening in
you're
the
not
background.
going to lunch.
You're not
unable to do something.
The only thing you can't do is install any new packages while that's happening, because it locks the package update process.
It locks up the package update process. Yeah.
Well,
but I mean, and that's true.
You could
could choose to install that new package and then do the update.
You could install.
There's an off chance that could cause a problem or something, maybe.
Or you could install that new package using Snap or Flatpak while your app is happening.
That is true.
Which is, I don't know. It's a scary thing, security wise, right? It's a good thing. I mean, Snap does have. I'm not a huge fan of Snap. I think it's slower. I've noticed applications loading slower in Snap. Okay. Snap does provide a container for that application, which has some security benefits to it. I haven't looked deep into Flatpak. I actually just started using Flatpak to install certain applications on my systems, but I haven't looked deep into how that works. And I joke now in a tweet. I was like, so like updating Ubuntu, apt update, apt upgrade, snap refresh, Flatpak update, and then if I want to update my firmware, I'm using LVFS and doing FW update manager get dash updates to see if there's any updates that LVFS has for my firmware on my system. So it's like a potentially 5+ step process, because in my firmware, I'm just doing get updates. That tells me if I have updates that are available. I then have to issue more commands to apply those updates. So it's like, how
if you've done it more than 3 times, you should be scripting it.
But it's an interesting, not just usability thing, but security thing for Linux devices. How do I keep things up to date? And how many different systems am I going to be managing and maintaining to keep software up to date on my system? That's my concern. If I just do apt update, I'm not updating everything on my system. If I'm not updating the firmware on my system, my system is not up to date. And then there's caveats on that. If the vendor of my hardware that's somewhere inside of my computer system isn't participating in LVFS, I have to manually go to that manufacturer and apply those updates.
So here's a question, Paul. Say a year from now, somebody, a bunch of people install Nala, like there's probably people using this. A year from now, they abandon it. Right. The project is abandoned, or worse, they sell it to me, and I want to do something malicious with Nala, which is this thing that manages all your patches. What can I do with this now? This is like, I'm assuming this is maybe like a single person project. Like, do I really want to trust my systems to, project? And we're seeing this more and more now where, absolutely malicious parties are focused on getting access to open source systems, open source code, inserting stuff into it. I don't know if you guys saw the big blow up on GitHub today, where there were malicious strings inserted into thousands of projects on GitHub today.
Malicious Life has a great podcast that got me thinking about this problem. And they go all the way back to Ken Thompson. One of his early papers in research was focused on backdoors. Let me see. And I'm not going to do this justice. You go listen to the Malicious Life podcast. They do a phenomenal, Andrew Ginter, and they do a fantastic job of explaining it. But basically what Ken had presented way back in the day, I haven't gone back to look up the original paper and actually read it, but I want to based on listening to this, was exactly the problem we're talking about. And this is what we would, the phrase we coined today was supply chain security. Put that back in the very, very, very early days of Unix. And Ken's take on this was, okay, so you've got a compiler. And what if inside of your compiler, someone were to put code in the compiler that replaced your login function and built in a backdoor. Then everything that compiler would compile, if it had to do with login.c in those days, as an example, there would be a backdoor installed. But then he took it one step further in the early days. And I'm
a
not
remote
quite
access
sure.
Trojan dropper.
Yes. But he put there's a compiler that compiles the compiler. So you can kind of chain these backdoors in that every time you compile the compiler, the compiler that compiles the compiler has the backdoor that puts the backdoor on the compiler, so everything you compile, right? And Rand Levy made an analogy to like 3D printers. Like, what if you had a 3D printer that was printing 3D printers, right? And kind of took that analogy of, if I wanted to put a backdoor in 3D printers that printed 3D printers that had backdoors, that's essentially what, like an analogy to what Ken was talking about. It's the same thing that we're talking about today, in following back that supply chain, that in any link in the chain, what if the supply chain is malicious or compromised? Like, how deep does that rabbit hole go, and how smart can those various components be to go, every time you compile something, I'm going to put a backdoor in your software? And how do you check for that? Now, the thing I disagreed with wholeheartedly in that entire episode was Ken Thompson and others commenting on it were like, well, you wouldn't see the backdoor necessarily in the source code, right? If the compiler that compiles the compiler has the backdoor, and what you're compiling is binary code, you wouldn't see the source code necessarily that had the backdoor. It would be obfuscated in the chain, and you'd have to look into the binary to see the backdoor. And they're like, well, no one does that. And I'm like, not today. I'm like, no way. And they're like, well, what if you backdoored the analysis tools that would decompile the binary? And I'm like,
no one does that is the lamest excuse ever.
Excuse ever. But also, as we all know, those of us on the show and many of us listening, we know that there's many tools to decompile binaries and get that pseudocode, right? So you backdoor IDA Pro. Okay, but there's lots of other tools out there. We talked a couple of weeks ago about tools that would run all of the tools for decompilation and give you all of the results and compare them. Like, we have a lot more tools today at our disposal for decompilation to detect these type of backdoors. Now, whether we're running them or not or looking, there's certainly a lot of people running these tools. So to say that no one is looking at the binary to discover these backdoors, I think is a gross oversimplification of the, not the problem, but the resolution to this problem, that like someone's going to find it. I think more often than not today than maybe 30 years ago. Certainly there were, how many reverse engineers were there? There wasn't a role in an organization reverse engineer maybe 30 years ago. And so 30 years ago, I'll give Ken a pass that like not a lot of people are reverse engineering these binaries. So this could go
there's
unnoticed.
Not today.
Today, there's still, I think, a pretty good chance that someone's going to discover this by decompiling.
Right, but not at every organization.
No. Certainly, when we get into custom software and things like that, but it's more of a thing today than it was 30 years ago. Is my point.
But I was definitely, 10 plus years ago, I was that guy saying nobody's looking at. Yeah, sure, you could pull that off. In theory, but nobody's going to do this. And then the Snowden leaks happened, and I was like, oh,
people are doing this.
I was like, okay, yeah, maybe people are doing this. Ever since then, I was like, yeah, there's a chance somebody's doing this.
Welcome to my world. I'm like, no one's gone down to that firmware level to do that, and I'm like, oh, never mind. People have.
When you've got Travis Goodspeed decapping RSA tokens and turning them back on, and you've got brain, you've got Rick Farina pulling apart hardware in the most insane ways, and Dragorn building phones, like no, I'm sorry, there are people doing everything.
Yes,
anything you can imagine, somebody is trying it to get at the thing inside that.
And that's what I've realized in my day job at Eclipsium. One of the things I've realized is that much of this research is not new, and several of our posts at Eclipsium, and I'll talk about one we just published like literally minutes. Actually, I think we were live when this blog post went live, and when I added it to the show notes. So if you guys want to refresh, but go back into history, I've traced things back to 2009 that have dealt with Intel ME, and ME was introduced in 2006. If you look at Secure Boot, when it was introduced, there was very early research on that. So like I've traced back a lot of this really esoteric, if you will, research many, many years, and it's not necessarily new. So like there are, to our point, like there are people looking at this stuff. And some of the initial research may not be the ones that attackers and ransomware groups are using, today and thought about today, but it lays that foundation to produce in things that I've looked at. The initial research sparks interest from other researchers. They do more research, and then like before you know it, it's in malware toolkits and exploits are more common. And I've seen that not just in firmware, but in a lot of other different areas as well. I mean, look at what Ken Thompson was talking about probably 30 plus years ago is stuff we're still talking about today, right? And it may not be in login.c that was compiled on Unix systems. It's in all case in point, the pseudo-keystroke logger that I found. Actually, a great example, this project that I linked to in the show notes called Mara looked back at the Shelljack project and made improvements on it that it doesn't go to like a really low-level keystroke logger, right? We have physical keystroke loggers. I came across research in putting keystroke loggers in in firmware-based components. This one really just taps into the TTY to do what I call kind of like a pseudo-keystroke logger, right? It's happening in user space, not even in kernel space in this particular example. It was Netlink. Netlink is that bridge between user space and kernel space to perform certain activities. It was reliant on that to keep it in user space. Which I thought was pretty cool.
So the funny thing about attack surface is that unused, attack surface that hasn't been taken advantage of, will sit there sometimes for years. Mm-hmm. Like take the Mirai botnet. All these IoT devices with default passwords sat there for years. And they were a danger to no one until the moment they weren't. And right. Somebody wrote a script to basically go out, collect them all, and turn them into a botnet and use them for nefarious purposes. And that took them all of 24 hours or something like that to initially assemble that botnet at the speed that packets travel on the public internet. And that's how it happens. Like a lot of this research out there, some of it, maybe it's never practical for malicious use, but maybe it is, and the moment that we find out that it is, if we haven't done anything about it, it's usually too late at that point.
I do want to offer somewhat of a glimmer of hope.
A glimmer of hope. Thank you.
My story number 15 is an article that was authored by my coworkers at Eclipsium, and I don't want to seem like a shill or plug the product, but I do want to talk about this post because one reason, and the post is titled "A Brief History on How Iron Sharpens Iron in Firmware Security," and this is an interesting in the aspect of there has been security research that was performed, that has been presented at conferences, and papers have been published, that the glimmer of hope is it has influenced, informed, and shaped the programs and processes of several different vendors to improve the overall security posture of things such as secure boot and firmware security. And I don't just take this in the context of firmware security, right? Go a bit and find other examples of how security research has shaped what we do today in terms of security. And to me, this was a win to show that researchers are working hard to go, no. Like, this is an issue. Oh, it's an issue. So therefore, vendors that as large as Microsoft and Intel have, in open source communities, have changed the way they view security and maintain or implemented change as a result of this research. This is why we do security research, is to affect that change in our industry. And that's just one reason why I thought this post that my team put together, I didn't author this post, but my team put it together, and it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's a good history, especially like this is a great link to send somebody if you just want to get them up to speed real quick on the most recent history of firmware security, the last 10 years. And
it dovetails into kind of peripheral things outside of firmware. Like if you look at the screwdrivers research, that was essentially research that said certain drivers in your operating system, even from user space, can allow access to a lower level of access to hardware and firmware in your system, right? So this, like, drivers aren't firmware, they're drivers. And if we're getting the drivers wrong, that can allow for more devastating attacks. And the response to that was, we need to validate these drivers and have much more scrutiny on how these drivers are getting developed, implemented, signed, in the whole process.
And who are these drivers coming from?
Who knows? China. China's one of them.
Little five engineer shops.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's like Intel, Asus, Toshiba, Nvidia.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that the drivers, a lot of the lower level stuff, firmware, drivers, pieces, bits, bobs, whatever. And this goes for hardware, this goes for applications, this goes for a lot of stuff, comes from places that we don't think about. And that's why SBOMs and SPDX and Eclipsium are all out there trying to sort of corral that what would you say, those 5 engineer shops?
Yeah.
And trying to corral and make sure that the copy you're getting is the right copy. That the MD5 sums hash, that that nobody's done an evil grade on you or whatever. But
Josh, that's interesting when we think about revocation lists, right? And one of the things that was interesting to me is if you look at boothole, which was essentially there's vulnerabilities in grub bootloaders. Therefore, we need to revoke the vulnerable bootloaders fall out of the chain of trust for secure boot, because it would invalidate that secure boot process. Therefore, we need to update the revocation list. That had such an impact on that whole process that folks started to question, like, there is a finite amount of space that you have to store that revocation list. It's 32 kilobytes. And
is that it?
And some of the folks were like, if we keep revoking things over time, we thought we allocated enough space, but like, what if we run out of space? That would be really bad, and forced a process change to handle, that particular scenario. And I mean, I have other thoughts on revocation lists, because I think it's kind of interesting. Like, the chain of trust hinges upon that revocation list. And when I got started thinking about, I'm like, who's checking the what should be in the revocation list, what shouldn't? Who's notifying and updating that revocation list when there is, air quotes, like, bad software in the chain of trust, or we shouldn't trust this particular software, and therefore anything that carries that signature that denotes that it is that software, we shouldn't trust it? Is that on me as the user? Is it on the hardware manufacturer? Is it on the software manufacturer? How is that communicated out? Who should push that update? Is it a Linux distribution? Is it Microsoft? We start running into all these weird scenarios of, we know something's bad, but how do we get that bad stuff out and revoke its signatures? And once we update the revocation list, whose job it is to push it out, and that whole chain of trust. Like, we have the...
Sounds like we need a standard.
Trust.
A new standard.
It's all about trust, right? And there was a great Linux, I think it was the Open Source Security podcast, did a whole episode on this. I really like those guys. I don't remember their names off the top of my head. I believe their podcast is called the Open Source Security Podcast. They have the worst music in any podcast I've ever listened to, but some outstanding content. And they did a whole episode of, like, okay, like, back in the day, if Red Hat has a package and someone's compromised that package and the MD5 checksum for that, how do we know, and who communicates that, and who updates the signature, and how do you validate the whole process? Like, these are really hard problems to solve because we rely on the fact that there's this chain of trust that we have to follow to be able to revoke software and tell people, hey, you shouldn't trust this software. And that's super important. I mean, we talked about apt earlier. Like, who says which packages?
Didn't we talk about this on another show?
Yeah, which repositories am I supposed to trust? Which ones I'm not? This relates to apt. This relates to secure boot. The whole thing.
Were we talking about this on another show, Paul? Because somebody said that there was an update to some system that actually overwrote the memory needed for the revocation list, so it's not actually possible to do a revocation list on one brand of IoT.
Yeah, because like in secure boot, the revocation list has to be signed by the certificates. Like, again, that would like undermine the whole chain of trust if unauthorized people are able to change either the revocation list or the whitelist of, for lack of a better term, of what's good. Like, which hashes should I trust versus which hashes shouldn't I trust, hashes or certificates in the case of secure boot. Updates to those lists have to be signed and part of the secure boot process, right? If it's not, then there's no security in the entire system. Yeah, it's crazy. So my story number 15, there's a lot of great examples and a chronology, basically, of how this research, in this case related to firmware security, has influenced change in a lot of different areas, including SBAT. I mean, if you ever want to read about that, that's how the open source community is dealing with changes in revocation lists, specifically related to the secure boot process as related to shim. So yeah,
that music is really bad.
It is really bad. A great podcast.
It's like this.
Though.
It's like some MIDI piano music, like sped up.
It is, but do you have the names of the guys that host that podcast? Because they're great.
Josh and Kurt.
Yeah.
Josh and Kurt are awesome. Like, talk about finding a podcast and like relating to the hosts. I really like relate to those guys. I like those guys. Like, I would sit down and have beers with these guys. Like, it's a great podcast.
Go listen to the Iron Sysadmin podcast.
What is it, Josh?
Their music is horrifying. The Iron Sysadmin podcast.
I haven't heard that one.
Their music is horrifying.
I'm pretty sure
Smart
I chat
guys.
with these guys. I'm pretty sure I chat with these guys on Twitter on a regular basis. I recognize both.
I know them. Yeah.
We need to have them. I'm sure them on the show. We're gonna get them on the list. Yeah, we need to get these guys on the show. I also like speaking of two guys who do a podcast that I like. There's a podcast called Hacked, and they like basically take a security event or incident and they tell a story about it. Those guys are awesome too. They have a great rapport.
Ooh.
Very similar, like two guys just kind of chatting, like asking each other questions, but it's very much related to a story. That's a really good one as well. I like that one a lot.
Hey, why don't we talk about, like, I was really excited by the point you made about the Linux command of the week.
Yes.
So I'd really like to hear what your Linux command of the week is.
I was gonna save it till the end, but we can cover it. We can cover it now.
I wanted to make sure we didn't miss it.
Because again, like, I'm starting to like listen to a lot of these Linux podcasts, intertwined with a lot of security podcasts as well, to kind of stay up on what's happening in the Linux world. And they were talking about, one of the podcasts went through like a bunch of like cool Linux commands or something like that, which is super interesting. But my new favorite Linux command, and I had heard, there's been, I want to say, variations of this over time, and I think it culminated in a readily available package that you could install with one, again, back to APT, apt install Hollywood. And I was like, really? So you do apt? You guys are trying it now. Like, you have a Linux system and you're listening, apt install Hollywood, open up a new terminal window, issue the command Hollywood, and it executes all these really cool commands and stuff so that, like, on your screen, like, one section is the matrix, one section is running like top, So I tested intern Dylan walked in my office. As soon as he came in, I typed Hollywood. And I made my terminal full screen. And I was just talking to him. I'm like, yeah, I'm like working on a lot of stuff. He's like, oh, that's good. I'm like, no, like, dude, check out what I'm working on. He's like, dude, what is all that? I'm like, it's cool, huh? Like, I'm working on cool stuff. Like, it's all these commands are running. All the stuff is happening on my screen. And
it's a Gibson, son.
Right? It looks spectacular.
Son, that's a Gibson.
Yep, it looks spectacular. And I'm like, no, it's just a command that puts cool stuff on the screen. He's like, that's awesome. It's like anytime one of your coworkers or anyone walks into your office, like if you're working from home, so one of your family members walks in, just issue Hollywood, and it looks like you're doing like really cool stuff. I'm like, this is my new favorite Linux command. It's awesome. Josh, I think you're muted. You need to tap your mic. Give it a tap.
Thank you.
There you go.
I had to tap my mic. Yes, I come on. I literally unpacked it during the podcast.
I watched you unpack it. Yes.
Yeah. But there's a guy named Scott Shin. He's at Atomic Core. He's one of the founders of Atomic Core, and they do a hardened Linux distro, a really good one, by the way. And he used to have 4 or 6 actually coding windows on the screen at any given time because his ADHD was so bad that he'd write 3 lines over here, 3 lines over there, 4 lines over here, 2 lines over there, and he literally. Basically, and he was honestly, he was one of the primary open source maintainers for a lot of packages. OpenVAS,
yeah.
Greenbone used to use him to actually maintain and update OpenVAS.
Nice.
So interesting stuff.
Yeah, Adrian and I delved into OpenVAS and we did some of the lab stuff. It actually was really awesome. We talked about it on the show. We did a whole segment on it. Good stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's my new favorite Linux command. Again, just have that in your back pocket, issue that command, use it as your screensaver or whatever. It's cool.
I'm installing it into WSL2 as we speak.
Amazing, right? Yeah, you can run it on Windows. It's great. It's a great use case.
Oh wow, can you?
I'm curious to see how. Yeah, because it's just a terminal shell and it'll run. Send us a screenshot. Hit the print screen. Yeah, hit the print screen button while it's running in Windows.
And what's more is I haven't used WSL on this system in a couple of months, and I did the app update, upgrade. Took me maybe 2 minutes. I don't need what was it called? Nala.
You should have used Nala, and it would have happened way faster.
Nah, it was fine. I mean, it'd be nice if it was instant, but. Like I managed to do it. I started it halfway through you discussing this, and it was done before you finished. It's actually taking longer to apt install Hollywood than it was to app upgrade like 220 packages.
Yeah, there's because there's a lot of dependencies and installs a bunch of utilities to make all those windows.
It's initializing the mlocate database is taking the longest amount of time. I have no idea what the mlocate database is.
I don't remember.
Related to locate, I guess.
I did want to.
Oh my God! Maybe mobile location.
I did want to talk about an article that caught my attention for multiple reasons. The title was "Post-Quantum Encryption Contender is Taken Out by a Single Core PC in 1 hour." So things are not looking good.
Oh, no, that's not good.
Not good. Things are not looking
that's not good at all.
For SIKE. Did we pronounce that psych? I believe I was listening to a podcast and they pronounced it.
If it's not, psych. You have to anyway. Let's be honest.
You have to anyway because it's way easier to say psych than SIKE.
So was it a joke?
Yeah, right. I was thinking the same thing. Like, hey, we're going to be the
cracks it right away and you're like, psych.
We're going to be the
post-quantum
computing encryption engine. Psych. No, we're not.
Psych.
I think that's a 90s thing. Is that a 90s thing?
It is very much.
Very much.
PSYCH, though. Very, very different spelling.
This is SIKE. So, NIST. And so, psych may sound familiar, not just if you're a 90s child, but also if you were paying attention to Heartsbleed and read the research paper associated with Heartsbleed. That was the encryption protocol that they essentially broke using Heartsbleed. We talked about that in a previous episode, and we even tried to theorize and research where did this psych encryption protocol come from and where is it used. And we're like, it's not really being used anywhere. And now that makes perfect sense because this article says NIST advanced 4 additional algorithms as potential replacements pending further testing in hopes one or more of them may also be a suitable encryption alternative in a post-quantum world. The new attack breaks Psych, which is one of the latter 4 additional algorithms. Well, that would explain why it's not being used as much today, because it's a new algorithm with intention of being a post-quantum computing encryption algorithm that could withstand whatever quantum computing in the future would be able to break. Now, Psych is short for, see if I pronounce this correctly, super singular isogeny key encapsulation.
Yes, I think you did it right.
Isogeny, is that how you pronounce that? That was the one I was questioning.
I believe so.
Isogeny, yeah.
Super singular isogeny key encapsulation is now likely out of the running thanks to research that was published over the weekend by researchers from the Computer Security and Industrial Cryptography Group at KU Leuven. The paper titled An Efficient Key Recovery Attack on SIDH Preliminary Version described a technique that uses complex mathematics and a single traditional PC to recover the encryption keys, protecting the psych-protected transactions.
An hour's time.
On a single core
it's
PC.
Worse than that. It was a single core and 1 hour, and it broke the encryption. Now, you got to realize, I read the first page of the paper, and this is an incredibly involved mathematical attack.
Yes.
And to that end, that's great that they found this, because obviously this would have been bad. Now, realize as well that NIST has 4 candidates and 4 sort of maybe candidates, and this is one of the maybe candidates.
Right.
Okay. And also, none of them may make it. It's possible, entirely possible, that none of them will make it to be the chosen one, if you will. Because look, how many checks and balances and audits and everything has AES gone through? AES 256. Okay, it's been tested 1 million times. These things are brand new. Some of them are going to fall down. It's the way it is.
Can I just say it's awesome that we have researchers like this devoted to making sure that these are up to snuff. You know, I'm looking at Thomas Decroux, who's one of the researchers that broke this, that wrote the paper. His website, you know, his byline basically says, my research involves post-quantum secure cryptographic primitives with a focus on isogeny-based protocols. And that's what he do. That's what he does. And I'm really thankful that we have somebody dedicated to just, you know, making sure that this stuff is doing what we need it to.
I got Hollywood working.
Isn't it great?
It's really cool, and it changes randomly.
Yes.
Like now there's a picture of a guitar on my screen. I don't understand.
Oh my God.
It's doing ASCII art. Oh my God. I haven't seen ASCII art in so long.
It's freaking great.
Yeah, I flipped back to my terminal screen, and yeah, it's now running on mine. That's pretty amazing. I could share my screen for a live view if we want.
Oh yeah, let's do that. Let's
go for it.
Yeah, let's show the folks that watch the video version. Folks that watch the listening. I should say listen.
If you're watching, if you're only listening, like seriously, there's an install window, fake install window running one place. There's ASCII art running a different place. It's got a map of the world, like for Risk. Your public key has been saved. It's hilarious.
Are you getting this, Gus? Can you see the screen that I shared?
I don't see your screen. I still see you. We still see you, Adrian. You sharing the right screen monitor camera?
No, I am, because it draws a red border around it. Yeah, it might be the way that we use.
I don't know what you're coming in on.
Yeah, you're coming in on Zoom or Skype?
Skype. No, it's Skype.
Oh.
Are you you're on a Windows machine?
Yep.
I find the screen sharing on Linux sometimes it depends on what graphics driver you're using, whether it's the open source one or the NVIDIA proprietary one. And I've run into issues like that.
This is insane.
Linux. Yeah. Hollywood is.
I wish I could share this.
Like 7 or 8 years ago, I was running full Linux. I didn't have Windows anywhere in the house, and I was very happy. I loved it. And then I went to a conference and tried to present a paper, and my machine that was Linux laptop wouldn't connect to the effing projector, even though it connected to the one at home, no problem. And I had to drop my presentation to a USB, borrow somebody else's laptop. So I'm running Windows right now.
Yeah, people have reported that to me, Josh. Fortunately, I've not experienced that issue. And it's funny. I don't know if it's funny, but last week, Larry presented an awesome technical segment on Apple AirTags. And we had his Mac here in studio, and we couldn't get it to display on the video switcher. So I took his HDMI cable that he was plugged into. I plugged it into my Linux laptop, and my display came right up. And Larry couldn't get it working on a Mac. And he was like, it's a Mac. It should just work. I'm like, except when it doesn't. And so we had to get him a Windows laptop to do his presentation. Yes. So I'm like, see, it's not just Linux. It's not just Linux. And I think as Linux advances, that stuff gets better. I can tell you, Josh, that 7 years ago running Linux is a completely different experience today. And you've got a framework laptop, and I think you're going to put Linux on it, right?
I bought another hard drive to put Linux on it with. Yeah, I bought a 1 terabyte to throw Fedora on and try it. Have fun.
I think you're going to be happy.
Oh, I think so. How the hell do I break out of Hollywood? It won't take.
Yeah, that's it, Goose. You've got it up on a YouTube video. Yeah, if you want to.
See it for me.
Okay. I had to hit it like 3 times.
There you go. There's Hollywood. That's what it looks like for our viewing audience.
Nice.
It's amazing. It's awesome.
It's just doing
packet capture.
Stuff.
That looked like a packet capture. There's the matrix screen. Yeah, it's awesome.
ASCII art. Somewhere in there, they should throw some ASCII porn just for funsies.
But I was thinking, like in this studio or like my home studio, having a screen with a Raspberry Pi, driving it in the background.
That just always has that.
And just runs Hollywood, and that's just running in the background. Like that would be pretty cool, like on set, you know.
That would be really cool. That would be a great hacker podcast, background Easter egg.
For an alternative, make sure you install Hacker Typer on it as well, or have the website with a hot link on the screen for Hacker Typer. So somebody can run over there in the middle of a broadcast. Oh my God, the hackers are breaking in. And start doing Hacker Typer, pounding on the screen.
One thing to keep in mind, Hollywood does use your actual data to kind of fill like this garbage that it throws onto the screen. So you will see your username, your host name, maybe other data on there. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, so having a Raspberry Pi with like nothing special on it. Yeah, nothing special, none of your data on it. Do you guys run Samba? You guys run a Samba server like recently?
No.
I know what you're getting to.
Yeah, like I set one up here so we had a Drobo. I don't know if I talked about this on air.
You have many times.
Right, but like so the Drobo has had 2 catastrophic failures. And the first one was Tyler and I were like ripping it apart doing forensics. Tyler was helping me. We don't know why it failed. We couldn't recover any of the data, but we managed to get the Drobo back online. I'm like, okay. Then I did a firmware update on the Drobo, which caused another catastrophic failure, which some of you might remember me talking about soldering a header onto the board and all that stuff.
I remember that.
And then like I got to the point where I had to put it all back together and follow a bunch more steps. And I'm like, if this was the second catastrophic failure of our, NAS, I'm like, I don't trust this thing. We're not using it. Now I had a server already on the network with a 1 terabyte spinning drive that we were going to use for backups. And I cautioned everyone. I cautioned everyone again today. I'm like, look, there is one drive in this server. It's a spinning drive. Whatever you copy to it, make sure you have another copy of, right? Like, this is basically storage that serves as a cache. So if you're working on, in our studio as an example, some audio or video files, and you want to share that with someone, copy it up to the server that now runs Samba, and then copy it down to the other workstation where you're going to do that editing, right? So conceivably, there should be, in most points in time, 3 copies of this media somewhere. So if that drive fails, we'll swap it out and start over, probably buy 2 drives and do some software raid as a backup. But like configuring Samba on this thing was pretty easy. Like it's running, I think that one's running Debian, and like configuring Samba was super easy. I'm like, I'll do this for, I'm like, late at night, early in the morning. I'm like, well, I'm just going to configure this thing for you guys so it's running. But Samba, with great power comes great responsibility. An easy way to spin up a service like Samba to share files that's compatible with Windows, Mac, and Linux. Like, we were mapping these drives from all different operating systems. I tunneled over SSH and mapped a drive to test it. Like, usability is awesome, but a lot of responsibility there. There's been a lot of bugs and vulnerabilities in Samba, and this recent one is interesting. I don't know if you guys have connected Samba to an Active Directory domain. I've not done that level of configuration in Samba where it's actually part of the domain. But this bug, I think there's a series of bugs described in this article that have to do with Kerberos ticketing. It basically lets anyone become domain admin using Samba. So a user could thus change the password of the administrator account and gain total control over the domain. Full loss of confidentiality and integrity will be possible, as well as availability of denying users access to their accounts. It's like the full triad, all described in this article, my story number 2.
Yes.
Make sure you patch Samba.
So it's fairly niche. I know I have been responsible for connecting Samba on Linux machines to Active Directory using Active Directory accounts. But in this day and age, I'm not sure that it's all that common. Maybe more so on NAS devices, like you were saying. But yeah, definitely could be one of those things that bites you in the butt if you're not aware that somebody's actually done this in your environment and connected it to your AD directory.
Very true. One that I didn't see get a lot of press either. Like, I didn't see a lot of people covering this.
No, I didn't seen it before tonight.
Yeah, same here. And okay. No, never mind. How common is it? Actually, it's a good question. How common is it?
That's a good
Samba?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, how are you running across it in organizations? Are you running across it in companies? Is it only in home use? I don't even know anymore. I'll be honest. I haven't seen it in a while.
I suspect you'll see Samba all over the place. It's one of those packages that's not terribly visible. It's going to be used on potentially IoT devices. I think NAS devices
devices would scare me on this one, Adrian. It's a great point.
Yeah. Paul makes a great point there. I think the most likely place you're going to see this both in the home and in businesses. You'll see a lot of cases where people bring in their own NAS devices. Maybe the marketing department has their own NAS device, especially if they're, they get somebody on the team that's shooting a lot of photography or something like that. There's a lot of niche use cases where you'll see NAS devices, smaller businesses, legal stuff like that.
Small enterprise. Small enterprise. Like,
yeah, small enterprise. Absolutely.
I don't know if we're talking about this on air or not, but like, at what point in the size of your enterprise do you start adopting like real network attack storage or SAN devices, storage area networking? I think you're a pretty big organization when you're like, we're going to maintain like a proper SAN.
Well, that's when you graduate from the cloud,
right?
So most companies these days,
most companies these days, you're right, it's cloud.
they go to cloud, and then they graduate from the cloud when they're big enough that they're like, oh my god, the cloud bill is ridiculous. We could buy all this equipment for the same prices. Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, we can't move that much data in and out of the cloud, economically speaking. So we need to have our own stuff, right? Or just legacy stuff. I mean, think about how many storage area networks or even NAS devices are implemented before we had all this capability in the cloud and all this connectivity as well. If you made that investment, maybe you don't go to the cloud. I mean, maybe you do after it gets old enough, but that's a project, right? Yeah, so make sure you patch your Samba and use Nala to update your Linux systems to patch your Samba.
Get out of here. Get out of here.
Get off my lawn.
Your Nala.
We compile Samba.
It's going to get sold to the Russians. You'll be sorry.
We're going to compile Samba from the Git repository by hand, not using this APT stuff. That's how we did it back in the day.
Stage 1 installs. Stage 1 Gen 2.
It is literally how we did it back in the day, though. I think back to my days of Solaris, like when we wanted to update SendMail, the unlucky, like we drew straws, and the unluckiest of the sysadmins got the short straw that was like, yeah, it's your job to go compile SendMail to the latest version.
Right? Yeah. And you can't leave until it's done. Here's your dinner voucher.
And I remember the sysadmin, she had headphones on, and then like the ones you use when you go to the shooting range, like over the earmuffs to maintain focus, to block everything out, to compile SendMail. And that's what she was doing. And did it successful. I mean, after a few weeks, you got it working. Right? Haven't lived to you tried to compile stuff for over a week.
And you backed up that CF file.
Yes.
That config file.
Oh, yes. But you know, it's funny. I ran into that today, and I was like, I'm going to stop because this isn't in my critical path. I was just doing it as an exercise, and I was trying to compile, and you guys might have seen this in Slack, to get OBS to do a virtual background, because Riverside, which a lot of folks are using as a podcast platform, especially as I talk to other podcasters, in Josh, and this is one of your recommendations as well.
Right.
Several podcasters out there have evaluated platforms. Riverside is great, right?
Yeah.
But it's not like Zoom. It doesn't support virtual backgrounds. And I was like, being the curious person that I am, that most of us are, right? We're like, yeah, how would you do that? I'm like, oh, you can do that in OBS and create a virtual camera and have OBS do your virtual background and do it that way. And I'm like, well,
yeah.
I'm like, what if I were to try that on Linux? I'm like, okay, I got to compile this plugin. And so I start down the path of compiling the plugin, and I get like, you get all the way to the last step where it's like actually compile the plugin, and I got an error. And I'm like, and it's with CMake.
Of course you did.
I got it, but I'm like,
it's Linux.
Like regular make files, I can like work my way through them. Like CMake stuff is slightly more advanced, and I'm not as well versed in that. And I took a few stabs at it, and I'm like, yeah, no, I'm giving up. I'm like, so if you're on Windows or Mac, you guys should give this a try. Like, you can give it a try on Linux, but I couldn't get that working. And you know what? I'm not spending the unknown amount of time from this point forward to fix that problem, right? Because it's not on my critical path. I mean, my studio here, obviously, I don't need a virtual background. My studio at home, I did all the nice things in soundproofing, so I didn't have to have virtual background. So I'm like, well, it's not in my critical path. I was just doing it as kind of a thought exercise, right? And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm stopping at this point.
Are you using Ubuntu?
I am. That's one reason I use Ubuntu, because I find, one, it's an ecosystem I am very familiar with, and two, I find that I have less problems with Ubuntu, and if I do have a problem, someone else has more often than not run into that problem and can give me a pretty good tutorial that works 80-ish% of the time to fix my problem.
They've got their own repository. OBS Studio's got its own repository.
It does. And
it didn't work?
I installed so I uninstalled OBS from Snap because it said don't use the Snap version. And I added
You're going to give me nightmares.
I added the OBS PPA repository,
Right.
and then it said use apt to install the latest from OBS. Get your OBS, then install the libraries that you need to support libobs, right, from their repository. Then go compile the plugin, and I still got errors. That was one tutorial I found. And again, this was for like Ubuntu. Like, hey, here's how to get it working on Ubuntu. And like I said, that works about 80% of the time. Right? Whereas maybe if you're in other distributions, not as successful.
60% of the time, it works every time.
80% of the time.
Yep, exactly.
It's a Sex Panther, wasn't that? Yeah.
Let's go to cross-site scripting that leads to code execution. So this was an article from the Daily Swig that links to research from actually the folks at PT Security, which is interesting. If you look into Intel ME or a lot of other UEFI vulnerabilities in research, PT Security has done a significant amount. They apparently have stood up a new blog that doesn't have. So there's sanctions and a whole bunch of stuff because they're based out of Russia. But they do have a blog that is active today. It has 5 posts on it. Their most recent post is in 3 different web-based projects. They found cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, then took it the next step to go, based on this cross-site scripting vulnerability, I can gain code execution because of the way, could be due to basically other air quotes features of that particular application. So like the first one is Evolution CMS. So they found a cross-site scripting, reflected cross-site scripting in there, and they were able to use that to pivot to the administrator can upload files, or the file manager administrator can upload files within this application, and the uploading of files coupled with this cross-site scripting attack can lead to an attacker gaining code execution in this application. And they went through a couple of the FUD forum was another one, and Gitbucket was the other one, where in all 3 cases they were able to pivot. In Gitbucket's case, cross-site scripting, then in the application it allows you to run a SQL query, and those two, like vulnerability coupled with feature, allow them to gain code execution. Technical details aside, and everyone can go read those things. For me, this made it difficult. I think it makes it difficult. It is difficult to set the priority for a cross-site scripting bug, because what do you have to explore each one and understand the full impact of that vulnerability. And everyone does that, right? Everyone, we all do that? No, we don't. We don't all do that. That was the scary part for me, is understanding what on the surface could be a lower level, a lower severity vulnerability, that you don't realize that this was interesting because we talk about vulnerability chaining, where multiple lower severity vulnerabilities can be chained together to lead to a higher severity impact in the application, that it's not just one vulnerability with a high severity, it's 2 or more vulnerabilities chained together. But with this case, it was functionality, not another vulnerability. To me, that was really interesting to think about. Then how do we prioritize these things? And how much due diligence do we go through to go, what's my priority for patching this that we talk about so often?
A second flaw found in FUD forum. The name of it is FUD forum? I'm sure it's a coincidence. Okay. It's just funny that it's called FUD forum.
It is, actually.
I think it's a play.
When you do patching, I keep getting asked, like, what's the time scale for criticals and highs? I'm like, okay, well, what about mediums and lows? I'm like, well, we don't ever get to those. And so, really good. Like, if Tyler, I wish Tyler was here to talk about this, but if really, really good pen testers and cyber criminals are stringing 3, 4, 5, 7 mediums together to get in that way. And it's just not cool. So,
I was listening along these lines. I was listening to the Shared Security Show, Tom Est and Kevin Johnson. And Kevin was talking about specifically this, and he gave an example. He was like, we're in a customer engagement, and in the application, we found this ID, right? And he's like, I'm being, trying to obfuscate the exact details of this. But he's like, no, we found this ID. And the client was like, well, I don't think that's a big deal. Kevin's like, I kind of think this could be a big deal. And they went back and did some more. They did the due diligence, to their credit. They did the due diligence to go, okay, what does this really mean if a potential attacker could find this ID? And they're like, oh, no, you're right. Like, this could lead to like a really bad thing. Because Kevin's like, at this point in the test, I don't know how you're using this ID or what the significance is of it, but I think it could be really bad that we could enumerate this particular ID. This to me is very similar, and I'm sure Kevin and many others that do application tests like this are like, I found this cross-site scripting vulnerability. I think it could have a significant impact, right? But showing that impact and or having the customer engaged enough and diligent enough to go explore the impact of that is very interesting. And how often does that happen? How often does it not happen is kind of what it got me thinking about, Adrian,
Yeah, FUD actually, for those who want to know, stands
You're
for
enamored-
fast. Fast.
You're enamored with the FUD forum.
I have
the
to.
FUD forum.
Fast, uncompromising discussions. Not fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
That's a backronym. I'm sorry.
It's a little play on words there. Yeah.
Christmas. That's a total backronym. Some interesting stuff. Like, if I had to characterize all of the stories for today that you picked out, obviously, favorite Linux command, that's cute, but it's not lots and lots and lots of 0 days. It's really everybody taking advantage of all these little side things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah.
And it's just fascinating. I apologize.
But John, a lot of it comes down to supply chain too. A lot of the things we talked about are related in some way to the supply chain. Like, I'm using this encryption algorithm, and it was proven to have a vulnerability, and it's in my supply chain. And how do I know that? And then how do I remediate it? And I've got this cross-site scripting bug. Maybe it's a public cross-site scripting bug that is apparent in is in your supply chain through a library or wherever, and I have this bug. What's the significance of it? But I think the complicated thing when we get into in vulnerability management and supply chain security is, what if these things tie together? And how do I evaluate risk of things that tie together? I mean, the Samba bug is like, Samba's not that case that we talked about, right? Like, that's a really bad vulnerability and you should go patch it, right? Well, some of the other things we talked about are in that supply chain. We talked about revocation lists and other stuff. An example that I saw too on the firmware security side was researchers put Intel ME's firmware under some scrutiny and said at certain points in time, if an attacker's on your system, there's a local exploitation that could happen, where if an attacker's already on your system, they could gain code execution inside of Intel ME, which sits at ring -3, which is bad. But in other research I was doing, Intel's active management technology, that could also have a vulnerability that allows an attacker access to active management technology, which could then be a conduit to the local exploitation of Intel ME. So now you just took if you have both of these two vulnerabilities, regardless of what they are, one vulnerability that's remote exploitation into AMT and a local attack against ME, and there's multiple that exist in both. If you have that combination, that's a much higher risk level. And it needs attention like now. But just having one, you might set a different priority for. And how do you figure that out? That's what I started thinking about this week. I'm like, how do we give people the tools to figure that out? Like vendors, you talk about this in your show all the time, right? Like, Adrian, there are vendors that can help with this problem, but how much are we understanding the chaining of vulnerabilities to the point of cross-site scripting, chaining a vulnerability with functionality to achieve what's basically a higher impact? I want to know about the higher impact.
Well, so there's some ideas that I've worked on for these kinds of issues, and a lot of it is like, one of them is the idea of red flags versus yellow flags. The idea that you don't have to know everything the attacker is doing, as long as you see one or two things, enough things that it raises an eyebrow, and you start to look into it, and you discover what they're doing there. You can still detect an attack, right? And the other thing is the importance of basics and baseline stuff, where, like, can you anticipate these kinds of chained vulnerabilities and stuff like that? No, but if you dig into it and you look at the different things that you would need to detect to know that the attack is going on, the conclusion you come to almost every time is, okay, if I'm doing basic anomaly detection and looking for weird things happening, I'm going to see this. I'm going to know that this is going on. Or if you take, you do some basic hardening or take some basic precautions, it tends to break a lot of this multi-chain stuff. Right. Like in the, the one you're talking about, like one of them, the admin account has to read the message, like if you prevent that message from getting to the admin in the first place, it's not gonna, it's not gonna execute the exploit that's in that message.
But I think we're on the same page, Adrian, in that I kind of summarize that as reduce your attack surface as much as possible, but also do everything you can to detect and have monitoring to detect anomalies in your network. If you kind of think of it that way, it almost it lessens the importance of understanding all of these chained attacks, right? Like if I'm just diligent and so I'm just diligent and like, look, I want to make sure like AMT isn't exposed to the internet, and I'm addressing that to you, all 3,600 plus of you that have that port exposed to the internet, like I found on Shodan. I'm addressing that to you. Like, reduce your attack surface there. Also, I think that ties into patching, is reducing your attack surface as well. Have a process for applying, again, we talked about Samba, we talked about these web applications, we talked about firmware. Have a process for applying that, and maybe like it's not the highest severity thing, but do your diligence, because if you don't patch it, there might be a significant impact. So like I'm saying with firmware, with Intel ME, like make sure you patch that stuff, because the impact of an attacker hitting on that level on your system, detection is going to be super hard. And then that's the third thing, like Adrian's saying, is have that detection to be able to detect those anomalies.
Yeah, but here's the problem. You've got to be able to quantify the risk, because we have a limited amount of bandwidth and personnel, right? So you've got to be able to quantify the risk of, if I ignore Intel ME or AMT or whatever, right? But I work on the cross-site scripting. Am I doing the right thing? Am I prioritizing it properly? Because nobody's able to prioritize these things properly, as far as I can tell. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, in that case, it's separate groups, right? Like, you want to go to your IT group that's managing your servers and have a discussion with them about what's the process for updating firmware, right? AMT is actually a feature set within Intel ME. You can have multiple
within
states.
The ME,
you can have multiple
states
and all that stuff, right? And so that's one thing. But you also want to have the conversation with their developers on how you prioritize those things as well. So like collectively it's resources, but you're resource constrained in these compartments in your organization as well. So that affords, like, it's not the same group basically that's patching your cross-site scripting that's patching your Intel ME. in a larger organization.
No,
right?
no, not at all.
Right. In a smaller organization, it might be the same group of people where, Josh, you definitely have that problem you describe of how
in a smaller organization, neither of those are even on your radar.
Yeah. Yeah. You're just worried about getting your Windows operating system patched on,
and phishing.
Phishing.
I think regardless, like I talked to like my hairdresser
yeah.
is worried about phishing. Business of one, and she's very aware of it. She gets these shady texts and stuff like that all the time, and she hits me up and she's like, "Is this something I should be worried about? Should I click on this?"
But I think in those cases, and in both scenarios, whether you're all the way down at the firmware level or way high up in the stack on the application level, you outsource that stuff. I don't want to maintain my own web application if I'm a small business, right? I want to outsource that stuff so that my provider is responsible for applying those patches. Now, that your mileage might vary depending on your provider. Likely in that scenario, they're going to do a better job of helping you maintain your systems because more of the responsibility is on them. So if I host that FUD forum, instead of FUD forum, going, I'm using something different for some application that's
we're getting in Discord, we're getting suggestions of the next exploit that comes out should be named Brony Punch.
Yeah.
And it needs to come out like in the next 2 days, just before Black Hat and DEFCON.
That's right. But, on the firmware side, what's interesting is I would go towards vendors that control more of the supply chain and have...
Oh, yeah.
Because the vendors that control more of the supply chain from a firmware perspective increases your chances that firmware just comes along with your regular updates. I still maintain my Microsoft Surface Pro 3, it's the only device that scans clean on my whole network when I scan it with Eclipse products, because Microsoft controls the entire supply chain. They're the operating system manufacturer, they're the hardware manufacturer, and they're the OEM that controls all of that firmware. And so their UEFI, their EC controller, all those components, and they control everything. And they've done a great job to make sure that's updated. So if I'm in your hairdresser, small business, or whatever, my recommendation, go buy that Microsoft Surface laptop. It's arguably the most secure device in my possession across all my devices.
The same could be said for Chromebooks. I mean, you're making the same argument.
Yep.
Well,
great.
Different hardware manufacturers.
Well, if you get one from Google, right? Because Google then controls the entire supply chain, and they have their own.
The Pixelbooks and the Pixel Go and something like that. Yeah. Yes.
But that you get Acer and all these other and I don't want to pick on manufacturers, but then you start running into, from my perspective, where I work in my day job, right? You start running into different supply chain issues of, processor and hardware comes from one vendor, firmware and software come from another vendor, operating system comes from another vendor, and now it's a crapshoot as to when and how often you're going to get, or if you're going to get updates after a certain point in time.
What about Macs? They control that whole ecosystem within their walled garden, right?
I would put that on my list of vendor you should go to for a small business for sure, right? Especially when you get into M1, because they control more of the hardware in that particular
even
scenario.
The chip fab.
Even the chip fab. Then they control the firmware, then they control the operating system and the hardware, and I would absolutely, Adrian, put them in that classification. Now, whether or not Apple's going to be, how diligent they're going to be about applying security updates, and also how diligent their users are going to be about applying firmware and security updates is a different story, like how aggressive they're going to be in pushing those things down. Microsoft, in my opinion, is, even though we give them some flack every now and again, they're pretty aggressive at pushing updates, right?
They spent a lot of money.
Yeah.
They spent a lot of money on security, on updates, on proper operation of their system.
And you see it when you configure Windows, Josh,
hundreds of millions of dollars.
When you configure Windows, is like, I want to update as often as possible. And you have to kind of go out of your way to go, no, slow down. I don't know if I want all those updates all at once. But Microsoft's done a great job of that.
Yeah, they're like, I'm kicking you off the computer at 10 o'clock. What? I need to run an update and reboot.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, I still have work to do. I don't care. Screw you.
Yeah.
Restart. And it's restarting on you.
And those are scars from early 2000s The worms running around and taking down the
God.
internet and stuff and taking down your whole network, right?
It's interesting how the more things change, the more they remain the same. The names may be different. Microsoft is now a security leader with Defender and everything else, and then and Linux in certain circumstances, Linux in an IoT world is a security dragger or follower.
Yeah, in the IoT space for sure. I mean, Microsoft now has their own attack surface product. I'm sure you're going to cover that tomorrow, Adrian.
Oh shit! Did I miss something?
Did I not send that to you?
What was the acquisition?
No, I don't know if they made an announcement that Microsoft is now offering, and I didn't plan to cover it on this show, but now that
I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I saw that this week. Microsoft Attack. They're in like the attack surface management game.
Okay.
Oh shit! They have Defender external attack surface management.
Yes.
I hate that they're using Defender for everything. Defender was an AV product.
Yeah, I know.
Microsoft announces new solution for threat intelligence and attack surface management.
And this did not come from an acquisition.
Microsoft Defender external attack surface management.
Gives Discord for everybody.
Gives the teams the ability to discover unknown and unmanaged resources that are visible and accessible from the internet. Well, there you go. I mean, that's how we would.
You can also get direct access to real-time data for IOCs from Microsoft's threat intelligence group. That's really cool.
It's there's a wide range. Like external attack surface management runs a wide gamut.
Sure.
It's almost like saying, an IOC scan is antivirus, right?
Yep. And this was announced.
You've got endpoint protection, which has whole disk encryption baked into it. It's got file integrity monitoring built into it. It's got antivirus. It's got next gen antivirus. It's like 10 products in one. And external attack surface management is kind of like this.
And to the point of the Discord too, like, this is not free. This is, you had to pay money for this.
Probably. They bought Risk IQ. It's the Risk IQ acquisition. That's really cool.
And it dropped yesterday.
Oh, it is.
It is Risk IQ.
I forgot about Risk IQ. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, no, we knew about that. We talked about that forever ago. So
but they made
this is just the rebranding.
Right.
This is the rebranding.
The official announcement that dropped yesterday. Yep.
Gotcha.
It's pretty cool.
That had been. It took them a while. Like the Risk IQ acquisition was last year, I think.
Yeah. Those things take.
It was almost a year ago.
More on the supply chain supply chain is all the rage these days. Malicious NPM packages have been compromised again, and this time they're targeting Discord users. And I haven't kind of dug into exactly how this attack plays out. I don't know, as a developer or as a user of software that uses the compromised NPM modules, the NPM modules have been backdoored, if you will, to have capabilities specifically to go after Discord credentials, which I thought was an interesting, regardless of how it plays out, but it's targeted at Discord credentials.
What is the connection between NPM and Discord?
That's what I put. Well,
it's the mobile.
Well, there's direct connections there in that you're running the Discord app and other apps like Slack are what is the run JavaScript local on your machine?
Node.js.
Node.js, right?
Node.js, yeah.
Node.js.
And they're stealing Discord tokens.
Electron, right? It's an Electron.
Electron, yeah.
Right, run JavaScript. So it could be, I don't know, I don't think it was, from what I read, I don't think it was specific to like backdooring your Discord app. It wasn't like a supply chain issue with Discord. I kind of read it as if you're using some application that has these libraries, the libraries will then search your system and steal your Discord tokens to be able to log into basically a token stealing attack for Discord. Yeah, it's aimed at stealing Discord tokens as well as victim IP addresses from infected machines. This came from Kaspersky.
I'm going to have to pick up one of my kids. It's absolutely bucketing down and like thunder shaking the windows storm here.
Your kids are outside?
No, at work. From work.
Gotcha.
I have older kids, so they have jobs and stuff.
I thought you locked them out of
he's an old man.
I thought you locked them out of the house for the podcast. Like, hey, kids, wait outside while I do the podcast.
Yeah, I'm the young guy. I have the young kids.
Yes. They're inside and they're safe. My story number 10 was GNU TLS patches a memory mismanagement bug. This is a double free vulnerability. But what I thought was interesting was you see new TLS and you're like, oh, well, that's nice. But then you got to look into all the projects that use that. And it's like FFmpeg, GNU-PG, MPlayer, QEMU, RDesktop, Samba, wget, Wireshark, and zlib, to name a few, that use this particular library. So make sure you check that out. Wrapping up quickly, I thought this was hilarious. LockBit ransomware sideloads Cobalt Strike through Windows Defender. So it's a Windows Defender command line utility that they're using to load malware or load Cobalt Strike payloads onto the system. So
through Windows Defender. That is just absolutely brilliant.
Right? They're using Windows Defender to load Cobalt Strike, to decrypt Cobalt and load Cobalt Strike payloads, which is like, talk about using your own weapons against you. That was...
Well, they've been having Cobalt Strike problems for a long time now. Cobalt Strike was hacked, cracked, and it's been used for bad things for what, the last year-ish?
Oh, longer than that, yeah.
Is it longer than that? Okay, whatever. And for it to sideload Cobalt Strike through Windows Defender, though, that's just like insult to injury, man.
Mm-hmm.
That's just painful.
Yep.
So I don't even know what to say.
My story number 14 was VMware is shipping patches for authentication bypass security hole. I love authentication bypass. It's becoming one of my favorite vulnerabilities that's out there. It just opens up so many possibilities. And the fact that we still have them today is just, we talk about all these really cool exploitation techniques, and oftentimes it just comes down to a bug that lets you bypass authentication, as we've seen in VMware. And this is a huge application, security problem that we see in many different, from small to really large applications. So love the authentication bypass. Josh, you've been
VMware's having so many problems with they've got the acquisition that just happened, and they had some significant issues. What, a month ago was it? 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, we've covered VMware. You're right, quite a bit.
Lot lately.
Yeah,
and it's okay. And I'm really curious as to what's going to happen when Broadcom says, "Okay, we've got to staff up our product security teams," because they're going to have to. So this is interesting. And in a larger sense, it's interesting because Broadcom's going to have to staff up some security teams. VMware downstaffed their workstation teams. VMware downstaffed
I heard that.
A lot of teams. Now Broadcom has them. Broadcom is going to have to do some work to update and right size in a big way the product security teams to make sure that things like this don't happen if they want to realize the value of their investment.
Well, if they want to continue that enterprise adoption, right, they have to maintain some level of security, and authentication bypass is not good. It's not an excusable thing in an enterprise setting. Like, they rated this the highest. I'm doing this. It said the vulnerability carries VMware's highest severity rating of 9.8 on CVSS v3. Should be remediated without delay.
I get the feeling that some people might be canceling their Black Hat DEFCON plans because of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's going to piss them off.
Thing is, if you're all in a VMware, where do you go? That's the other problem. But You're
Yeah,
right.
I mean, well, okay. So look, let's be honest. It has come down to the point that VMware, speaking of virtual machines, is effectively becoming last generation. You know, containers are now, and VMware's like, oh no, we do container orchestration. Sort of.
Yeah,
you know,
sort of
so
how I
what's going to
described it.
happen? So VMware being the juggernaut that they were, are they going to continue remaining a juggernaut, or are they going to turn into an IBM where good technology goes to die?
Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
Macro blocking in Office. We talked about this in the past few weeks, right? There was the Microsoft it's off by default, now it's on by default, off by default kind of setting. This article was interesting because what they found, like if you really dig into it, malware authors really don't care because they bypass macro blocking by using ISO files, RAR files, zip files, and IMG files to send macro-enabled documents because the files themselves will have the MOTW attribute, which is
Motto of the week. What is MOTW? I honestly don't know.
It's mark of the web. Mark of the web, I think is what they call it.
He's been marked. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
So basically, like if your macro-enabled spreadsheet is inside one of these files, Microsoft says like, no, it's good. And then the document's extracted, and users will still have macros enabled for malicious code to execute because it doesn't have that mark of the web attribute associated with it. I really want Tyler's like done some of this attack. I wanted to get his take on this one too because I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I wish he was.
Yeah, because they talk about LNKs, DLLs, and executable files. They can do that too, but it's basically a way to get past some of this macro blocking, right? Is to use those other ISO, RAR, zip, and IMG formats. And I've seen that before.
You know,
it's not
this
a new
reminds
technique.
me. No, this reminds me actually of POC GTFO, Travis Goodspeed's publication that Bill Pollock turned into the Bible for InfoSec. Two volumes, by the way, the old and the new. Couldn't resist. But what they did was when they would send them out, it would be a zip file that could unzip to a PDF that would open up to be the original zip file, and you go back to the original zip file, and you could change one character, and then it was a text file. Like it was crazy. I think they called it file format fuckery.
Yes.
And you know, with this stuff, macro blocking, whether you turn it on or off, there's so many ways to screw with these things that I wonder if macros are ever going to be useful again. I don't know. We'll see.
And we talked last week about different ways to turn it off, and there being a lot of settings. Like it's not just as simple as on or off. There's a lot of tuning involved in different settings to do that. And in this case too, you know, also recognizing ISO files and RAR files and things like that come into your organization. Cool. Anything else you want to talk about this week, Josh?
No. I mean, honestly, it's fascinating. If I had to characterize the stories, you know, the Apple network traffic going through Russia for 12 hours is sort of networking stuff. But other than that, it's a lot of things that are not as you know, it's a lot of mediums, and it's interesting that we're seeing so many mediums turn into such a problem. Okay, and children, sorry, and we're seeing so many mediums but strung together. All of these problems that we're seeing in these news stories that you came up with. There's a lot of things that might not have even caught attention, but you string some of them together and you're in trouble. This is cool stuff. Cool stuff, man. Good choices.
Absolutely. Next week is Black Hat and DEFCON?
Is it next? Yeah, it's next week. Oh my God.
Next week. It is next week. We do have a show next week. We will only be airing the news live because I have the exclusive on some stuff that can't air till the 11th. I'll talk about that more next week. Talk about that more next week. But we have the scoop on something, and I'm very much looking forward to next week. So, Josh, thank you very much for all of your help this week. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching to this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Over and out.